I'm going to just say very brief words of introduction. I'm going to turn to Gary, and then Phil Stevenson's who's linked us together. Phil is going to come up and give a broader framework of why we're here today. But I would like to just to say a bit about why this is a priority for us, CSIS. We started off as a Cold War think tank focusing on defense. And that still is how we're known in Washington, and it does represent about 25% of our work. Greg is in that part of our organization that does focus on national security issues, but we think there's a larger definition for national security. Everybody in this room knows, and certainly our friends from the Coast Guard know, that criminality tends to be the logistics backbone for a lot of other bad things in the world. Criminal networks become the pathway for terrorists. They become the pathway for human trafficking. They become the pathway for illicit narcotics. I mean, so criminality, and let's call it what it is. Illegal fishing is criminality. But because of its taking place on the high seas, it doesn't have the consciousness in governments' minds about its implication. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to be involved with this project. And I have even bigger ambitions that I hope we can work on together. We've watched island building in the South China Sea, and we've confronted China to say, you're doing the wrong thing by claiming these islands, which have legitimate territorial disputes between other sovereign countries. And of course, every time you confront them on sovereignty question, all of China comes together and say, we're Chinese, we're behind our government. What we should be saying is you're destroying precious environments. And that will trigger a groundswell, I think, inside China, because they're very worried about their own ecology, their own environment. We need to be thinking about this in a very different way. And I think for us to do that, we need to be partnered with different people. That's the whole purpose of trying to join together with National Geographic, this marvelous program that they've developed called Pristine Seas. When we heard about it, we said, can we talk with you? Can we do something with you together on this? Because we think this has much larger implications for not just the oceans, but for the human ecosystem that's exploiting these properties, and from my standpoint, the insecurity that emerges from that. So this is a very large question for us. We're delighted to have a chance today to partner. Gary, let me ask you to come up on behalf of National Geographic, doing such a phenomenal job. And like I say, while he's speaking, I'm going over there to watch this show. Please, Gary, come on. Welcome, Gary.
Hey, John, thank you so much, and it's great to see a filled room on the illegal fishing topic. We're so proud to connect with CSIS, and John and his colleagues do an amazing job here, and he's been able to transform, as he said, this institution focused on issues into one that's really trying to tackle the issues in the world we all live in. You know, John, at National Geographic, we're a 130-year-old startup, as we like to call it. And it was really founded in 1888 to use the power of science, exploration, storytelling to indeed change the world. And we think today about a world where there's going to be some 9.5 billion people on the planet by the year 2050. Twice as many people today are on this earth than when I graduated high school, which wasn't that long ago. So how are we going to feed them, provide energy for them, house them, educate them all without burning up everything in or on the planet is the existential question that whether you're conservative or liberal, Republican, Democrat, whatever, that's the existential question we all have to face. So all of these issues, including illegal fishing, come down to that fundamental question. It's creating a planet in balance, and it's National Geographic's job to help invest in people doing incredible innovative work and illuminate the stories through the power of photography and the power of research and the power of storytelling through print, through digital media, where we have today 82 million Instagram followers. We're just closing in on Kim Kardashian, so you guys need to help us. And of course through television, and we're very proud of the programs we have on the channel, including The Long Road Home, which premiered last week, a fantastic version of Martha Raditz's powerful book about the Iraq War and the members of the military who came home from a bloody day in Sadr City. So using that power to try to illuminate these issues is what National Geographic is indeed all about. Several years ago, under the leadership of Enrique Sala, who was a professor at UC San Diego, who decided one day that he was sick of writing the obituary of the ocean, and he wanted to go out and do something about this. Came to National Geographic and created this Pristine Seas project, which my colleague Dan Myers is going to speak about today, which is now, I think, Dan, been critical in saving up to 5 million square kilometers of the ocean. It's had a profound impact as Enrique and his colleagues try to create sanctuaries around 20 important bodies of ocean by the year 2020. And of course, the next great issue is going to be the high seas, which is what brings us up to today's panel. And the panel has been inspired by the leadership of CSIS board member and our International Council of Advisor member, Phil Stevenson, who's here today. And Phil, hats off to you for investing in the two organizations and inspiring us to tackle this issue head on. It is a critical issue going forward, and I'm eager to hear about the report today on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And John, we stand in concert with you to work together with CSIS and National Geographic to see how we can transform the world to focus on these issues. The good news is that we're 4 or 5 blocks from the White House. You're kind of 4.5 blocks from the White House. And we're at the center of power where good people can get things done. So we hope all of you will be inspired by today's report to act and to do something about this critical problem. And I just wanted to thank you all for being here. And it's my pleasure now to introduce the person who has inspired us to come, and that's Phil Stevenson. Phil, thank you.
I've had the privilege of knowing John Hamre for over 10 years and Gary Nell for almost 5. I have seen both of these men lead their respective institutions to greater heights, and I think that's due to their shared commitment to being nonpartisan, intellectually honest, forward-looking, and if I may add, taking all the time a global and even optimistic view of the world. So it surprised me when I learned that these two neighbors, literal neighbors, had never really collaborated before. That's why my foundation, which focuses on marine exploration and protection, is, I was going to say proud, but I think we're more humbled to have been a small catalyst of this first project on illegal fishing and its effect on national security. I hope this is the beginning of a dialogue or even something more. As John mentioned, criminality is of all different types on the high seas, and our goal should be to extend the rule of law out as far as possible onto the seas. That's what we're trying to do, and I hope you will enjoy the panel today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Hamre, to Gary Nell, to Phil for those opening remarks, and especially thank all of you for coming out on a morning when we have a hard security Navy panel right next door. As Dr. Henry said, I think the fact that we can today fill a room at a DC think tank founded on Cold War hard security issues to focus on IUU fishing is a testament to how far these issues have come, but we have much farther to go. Outside of the environmental and fisheries enforcement community, the term IUU fishing is still relatively new. I can tell you, even going up to the Pentagon, to folks who don't focus on this issue, we have to explain the acronym every time we use it. So we have a long way to go, but it is important for us to recognize that this is more than an environmental issue, it's more than a food security issue, it's more than an economic issue. It really is about hard national interests. And I'm going to briefly give an overview of our takeaways from this report, which we worked on over the last few months with help from all of the organizations represented here, most especially National Geographic. But then I'm going to throw it to the real experts here to talk about these issues and how much farther we still have to go. My background is I run the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative here, which focuses primarily on the South and East China Seas. And we've certainly watched environmental and overfishing issues be a corollary to these disputes, but it's never been the heart of how we discuss it in Washington. I'm also a fellow with our Southeast Asia program for 6 years now, and over those 6 years we watched issues like the wonderful AP reporting that uncovered the scale of human trafficking in the Thai fishing industry and the scale of arms and narcotics trafficking that goes on under the backdrop of IUU fishing. And yet all of these things have always been footnotes in our larger research. So I was legitimately excited to take on this project to try to bring those things to the fore. And the two main takeaways that we came up with in our research are that IUU fishing contributes both directly and indirectly to what we think of as non-traditional security threats. IUU fishing directly contributes to organized crime and criminal networks. It directly contributes to narcotic smuggling, gun smuggling, people smuggling, most obviously when you look at the press. It contributes in specific cases to money laundering, any number of illicit activities, and all of these things undermine human security. But then there is the indirect cost. IUU fishing directly takes money out of the pockets of governments around the world that most need it. When you look at places like West Africa or Latin America or the Pacific Islands, where governments are highly reliant upon funds from their EEZs, giving out licenses, selling licenses for fishing, when you engage in illegal fishing, you are directly taking money that would otherwise be used for things like development or defense or governance. It also directly takes money and livelihoods away from coastal communities, and all of these things we've seen contribute to the rise of illicit networks, of extremist networks, of piracy and high seas crimes. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence to suggest that in places like the Horn of Africa, the prevalence of overfishing, the destruction it causes on local communities and livelihoods is directly correlated to the rise of piracy, high seas crime, and even support for insurgencies and extremist networks. So if we ignore this issue, we ignore kind of the incubation for these hard security threats, it's much harder to deal with them 10 years later when we're confronting piracy, when we're confronting high seas crime, et cetera. There's still, as I said, a lot of work to do. Part of this is a legal problem. The high seas in particular, beyond national jurisdiction, is largely the Wild West. We lack any good legal or enforcement tools to comprehensively come to grips with this. And there are certainly efforts right now in the UN and WTO to get at these issues, but we have a long way to go. With that, I'm going to shut up and turn to the real experts here. My colleagues, we have Ciara Reccio Blanco, who runs the Oceans Program at the National Maritime Law Institute. We have Dan Myers with National Geographic Pristine Seas, and then we have Lieutenant Jessica Conway, who's an expert on this topic with the U.S. Coast Guard. Dan, I'm going to ask you to start off first so you can give us an optimistic look at successful examples of saving the oceans before we depress everybody.
Well, thank you, Greg. That's quite the tall order. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much. Before I start, let me thank CSIS for hosting us today. This is, as we've talked about, a non-traditional security threat. And it's going to take new ideas, new partnerships, new coalitions to solve it. And I think that this partnership between CSIS and National Geographic, supported by Phil Stevenson and the Philip Stevenson Foundation, is a really interesting place to start. And at Pristine Seas, we're thrilled to be part of this policy discussion. I think it would be useful. So you heard a few things, tidbits this morning about why illegal fishing is a problem, but let's take a step back and talk about it globally. Why is illegal fishing a problem now, and why is it getting worse, and why do we believe it'll become an ever more important defense issue? So the first thing to know is that fish protein is responsible for is the primary source of protein for about 1 billion people around the world. At the same time, we also know that 90% of fish stocks are either fully exploited at this point or overexploited, meaning we're not going to get any more out of that resource, and there's really only 10% left that is untapped right now. Add on to what Gary was talking about earlier, that we're going to add another 2 billion people to this planet by mid-century. Then think about the ocean as a truly vast space, a very difficult place for maritime security operations to happen, and a weak legal framework that Greg was talking about, and you have a massive security problem. Natural resource conflict is one of the most common forms of conflict in history, and this is essentially a recipe for that. Now, at Pristine Seas, we're focused on it in 2 different ways. First, pragmatic for our program, and then policy-oriented. And I'll walk you through the pragmatic approach first. So as Gary alluded to, Pristine Seas is a 10-year mission to explore, document, and protect the last wild places in the ocean. And these wild places are what we consider as relatively unaffected by large-scale commercial fishing, by pollution, places that essentially resemble the and they also operate essentially as aspirational areas where we can look to and say, if we manage the ocean well, if we protect these places, potentially more can look like it. And so we are on a mission to protect as many of these as possible. Our goal is to protect 20, and right now, we've been on 23 expeditions over the last 9 years, and we've helped to protect 17 of these locations for more than 5 million square kilometers of ocean protected. Now, we are immensely proud of this legacy. We've worked really hard for it, and we've got 6 more expeditions to come, and we hope to increase that number, but we do know that the announcement of a protected area is just the beginning. If you're really going to make these places work, you need to have proper enforcement systems in place, as there are illegal fishing operations around the world who are looking for these last wild places to plunder. And so for Pristine Seas, we go at it with a very direct approach. When a new area is created, we go to the policymakers and we say, okay, do you have the technology available to surveil these large offshore areas? And oftentimes we're talking 100,000 square kilometers plus, really big spaces of ocean way out in the middle of nowhere. Do you have the technology that you can actually use to surveil, to catch the bad guy in the act? After that, do you have the legal system in place to be able to use that data that you caught with your surveillance system in a court of law? And finally, are you signed on to the various multilateral treaties that will help you leverage regional and international assets to capture bad guys, whether it's in your port or your friend's port right next door? So that's our pragmatic approach. And that works because we're a relatively small program. Again, we're talking under 30 places. But let's extrapolate that globally. If you look at the ocean now, we've protected about 3%. 3% total, maybe 1.5% in fully protected no-take areas. The accounting is a bit rough. The global community has already committed to protect 10% by 2020. So that already means we need to more than double what we've already done. That in and of itself is a tall order. Scientists now suggest that if we're going to sustain the life-sustaining capacities of the ocean, we need to protect between 30 to 50% of the ocean. Now, that's a completely different ballgame. And if you think about it a different way, that 3% that's protected now, that's represented by 13,000 individual MPAs. Imagine creating 13,000 different enforcement systems per MPA, then extrapolate that to 10%, then to 30%, then to 50%. It becomes untenable. So in reality, you have to attack the problem at the source. And you have to think about illegal fishing as a transnational security issue, because that's what it is. It's attacking natural resources and income for countries that are otherwise resource poor. And so, in reality, and many people have talked about this over the years, but we need to call a spade here. Illegal fishing is a national security issue, no matter what way you look at it. Greg referred to it earlier. When there are illegal fishing fleets that are going into countries in the west coast of Africa, already resource-poor countries, plundering those riches and running away with them, then you're already depriving those countries of much-needed funding. You're undermining the rule of law. In places like the South China Sea, you're increasing regional tensions. And, of course, these illegal fishing fleets are also vectors for other international crimes. Illegal fishing boats that stay out there for a year, 2 years, they require slave labor to work. These are not well-paid individuals. You'd never get the economics to work for you. On top of that, you have drug smuggling, you have arms trafficking. All the bad guys use illegal fishing as a way to get their job done. I was chatting with the ambassador from Costa Rica about a month ago, and he was telling me this amazing story that they watched a vessel fish illegally in their EEZ, and they were able to detain it. And they opened up the hold. They looked inside, and they found a bunch of finned sharks, already illegal in Costa Rica. But then they looked a little closer at the sharks, and they noticed something looked a little funny about the bodies. They were bulged out, and they had this split down the middle. They opened them up. They were filled with cocaine. This is not an uncommon occurrence in Central America, where illegal fishing boats are used by narco-traffickers as cover for their other illegal operations. There are a number of solutions we can look at now, and I'm sure we'll get into those later in the panel, but I hope that was a good general intro to why illegal fishing is an important national security issue now and will only become more so moving forward as these resources continue to decline. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Now I'm going to turn to Xiao, who may prove me wrong, but I suspect might throw some cold water on the optimism we just heard.
Thank you, Greg. And first of all, please accept my apologies for the funny voice. I think this is a good opportunity to remind everybody to have their flu shots in time. Anyway, as Greg was mentioning, and by the way, thanks again for inviting me to be here today. My name is Xiao Recio Blanco, and I'm the director of the Ocean Program at the Environmental Law Institute here in DC. So the Environmental Law Institute is a legal research think tank, so we analyze regulations. And so it was a bit challenging for me to think that I was going to be sitting in a panel with people that have really cool jobs and go on expeditions and have basically the kind of job that I want to have when I grow up. But what I'd like to think is that legal analysis is still very relevant in order for us to fulfill the objectives that are so dear to all of us in this room, like ending illegal fishing or allowing coastal ecosystems and coastal dependent communities to recover and to thrive. And what we have realized is that there is a huge gap of knowledge in social sciences, and particularly on legal studies related to ocean conservation. When you think that, for example, marine biologists have these very detailed databases of, for example, the health of coral reefs in the Caribbean, and so marine biologists can use those databases to have a detailed understanding of the evolution of the health of coral reefs in the Caribbean in the last 40 years. And then you can even combine that with other databases on weather patterns, for example. But we do not have such a database of, for example, the regulatory history of all countries in the wider Caribbean region that would allow us to just run a regression and identify what would be the best legal instrument to ensure better management of coral reefs or to combat illegal fishing. And this comes to the nature itself of legal studies and of legal frameworks. So each country has its own characteristics, its own legal frameworks, and that fragmentation acts as a very relevant hurdle to effectively combating big problems, global problems as such as illegal IUU fishing. So, but still, in this very complicated context, some institutions like Nat Geo have been able to open new doors and new opportunities for ocean conservation that were just in our dreams a few years ago, like the achievements that Dan mentioned of the Pristine Fish Initiative, or many of these new MPA commitments that are arising of our ocean conferences. What's interesting for us is that in the wake of all these big commitments and achievements, many questions arise, and many of those questions are of legal nature. So think of the example of a country that decides to create a new large MPA. How will that legal instrument, the specific legal instrument at the domestic level that is going to create the MPA, how will that document look like? Will it be a fully protected MPA with a no-take zone? Will it be a multiple use and multiple purpose MPA? Will it be just a bottom trawling ban? And once the legal instrument is enacted, and so it becomes a law that needs to be enforced, there's another suite of questions that need to be answered. So, hey, here's this picture of this fishing vessel that was fishing within the boundary of our newly created MPA. First of all, is this legal or not? It might be legal. If it's a multiple use MPA, it might be legal. But if it's illegal, will one of our local judges consider this photograph as enough evidence to prosecute? And if he does so, who will be held liable for that? Will it be the captain, the crew, the owner? Unfortunately, we don't have the answers to most of these questions because the answers lie on the specific regulatory frameworks of each specific nation. And so this fragmentation becomes one of our major challenges for addressing IUU fishing. In a way, the situation of coastal communities and coastal countries combating IUU fishing resembles as if a number of people were carving a huge monumental sculpture, but with very different and very small knives, and carving at different times, and without a real understanding of, or a real agreement on what the final sculpture is going to look like. So this is, it's of course a very complex problem. Sorry. So now, a good thing is that the report being presented here today summarizes very well some of the key advances to move forward in combating IUU fishing globally, such as the use of new satellite technology or enhancing cross-border agreements for surveillance and enforcement. I would add to that at least from a legal and institutional perspective, we still need to advance in 3 different fronts. First, countries need to make sure they know which agencies are taking the lead in fisheries management and fisheries enforcement. So basically solving problems of distribution of competences. This is a problem that we have identified in many different legal frameworks. Second, how should these agencies proceed? What are their main priorities? And many countries still need to solve in their internal legal frameworks the question of what's the approach they are following regarding fisheries management. Are we still in the classical natural resource exploitation approach, or are we transitioning towards an adaptive management and sustainable use approach? And third, and what I think it's even more interesting on the side of legal analysis is what exactly are we regulating and managing? And this arises from the idea that many of the topics that we are currently discussing on global management of fisheries and the creation of new marine protected areas is topics for which at this point we do not have legal definitions. So for example, countries are currently creating new marine protected areas in order to fulfill their obligations under the Aichi Target 11 and SDG 14, and it's basically conserving at least 10% of the waters under their jurisdiction. But what does conserve mean? Is it enough for a country to just declare a new MPA, to consider that they are fulfilling their obligations? Or do they actually need to prove that they are actually enforcing that MPA? Is a multiple use MPA that allows several sources, several ways of fishing enough to comply with that commitment? Finally, to conclude, I would like to go to something specific that the report mentions, and it's what the report describes as IUU fishing that facilitates the rise of other threats. And I would like to speak about this in the connection with small-scale fishing and with illegal immigration and human trafficking. Many IUU fishing activities do not come from large industrial vessels, but are conducted by small-scale and artisanal fishing fleets. And this is something that we have identified in many different countries. There is this pattern in which illegal and legal fishers are mixed because they are members of the same community. So they know each other very well. And what happens in many cases is that illegal fishers feel they have a sense of entitlement in any way. They might not have a valid permit, or they might be fishing, selling their seafood products without regard of the local regulations. But they are members of the community. Their families have been fishers for decades, so they have a sense that they are entitled to do this. And in addition to that, most fishers know that there is a near zero probability of being detected, most of these illegal fishing activities. The problem is that eventually this, we could say like low level of illegal fishing or low level of illegal fisheries crimes leads to huge problems and to an increase in human insecurity. And these abusive fishing practices are very devastating, particularly for those areas of the world with very vulnerable coastal communities in which there is basically no other source of income beyond fishing. For example, when I was doing research in northwestern Mexico 3 years ago, I interviewed this fisherman in his late 50s. He was a shrimp fisherman, and he had been a fisherman for a number of years. Then there was a crisis in the fishery in the Gulf of California, so he migrated illegally to the United States. He was working in agriculture for a number of years. Eventually, he became a legal immigrant here, but then he realized that the fishery had recovered, and he really enjoyed fishing. So he went back to Mexico, and he started fishing again. He eventually became the president of one of the fishers' associations. But then the shrimp fishery in the Gulf of California crashed again in the early 1990s, and this particular community has not recovered since. And this is it's really ironic and a bit frustrating, because we are talking about the Gulf of California, which is one of the most productive areas in Mexico and probably in the world. So it's a bit of a contradiction that coastal communities in this area are not able to have a decent living by conducting fishing activity. When I asked about this fisherman about the future, about his family, he mentioned that his son was a fisherman there, but had decided to migrate illegally to the United States. And the main reason was that there was basically no future for him in fishing. And so I think that shows another aspect of how illegal fishing from either the big scale and very small scale can have significant implications for security and for human security. And now the problem is getting even more complex because, as we know, illegal drug trafficking networks are getting more and more involved in illegal fishing in the Gulf of California. But anyway, in any case, I always think that I ask more questions than the ones that I provide answers for. But thanks again to Greg, and congratulations on the publication of the report.
Thank you, Sal. Finally, I'm going to turn to Lieutenant Conway to explain to us how the well-funded and enormous U.S. Coast Guard has stamped out IUU fishing within U.S. jurisdictions.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Lieutenant Jessica Conway. I'm a policy and data analyst with the United States Coast Guard, Office of Maritime Law Enforcement, Fisheries, Living Marine Resources Division. I'm honored to be here today to speak to you about IUU fishing and the Coast Guard's efforts to reduce it and the current challenges we're facing to effective enforcement. Illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing is a problem on both a local and a global scale, as we all know. The Coast Guard efforts support enforcement nationally as well as internationally, so within our borders and outside. IUU fishing threatens marine ecosystems, the economic value of fisheries, and food security across the world. We recognize that patrolling our own waters is not enough, since fish don't recognize politically designated boundaries. Illegal fishing and the conservation of marine habitats are global problems and require global solutions. The UN FAO estimates that approximately 68% of the world's fish stocks are fully fished and 31% are overfished, and I think this number is an old number and it's much higher than that right now. Additionally, 1 billion people across the world need fish as a primary source of protein, and approximately 4 billion rely on it as a source of protein, not just the primary. With an increasing population, demand for fish is growing and supplies are decreasing. To quote from a recently published article by Captain Jay Caputo in the U.S. Coast Guard Proceedings magazine, battles over politics and ideologies may be supplanted by fights over resources as nations struggle for economic and food security. The global fish wars are coming. This sounds really ominous. It's human nature, though, to find solutions to difficult problems. The Coast Guard participates in many initiatives to combat IUU fishing, and I'd like to highlight a few of the positives first. The Oceania Maritime Security Initiative, or OMSI. It monitors and detects IUU fishing in the western and central Pacific Ocean. It provides a persistent presence for maritime surveillance and security in the region. Coast Guard law enforcement detachments deploy on U.S. Navy vessels and cover a large expanse of the high seas and partner nations' EEZs as well. Since 2008, OMSI has resulted in 305 boardings with 55 violations. The African Maritime Enforcement Partnership, or AMLEP. This operation allows a framework for small African maritime forces, and it extends their reach. They may not have the resources to go very far, and so we extend the reach through their territorial seas and exclusive economic zones. Since 2009, MLEP operations have resulted in 171 boardings with 36 violations. Operation North Pacific Guard. This highlights international cooperation needed to fight large-scale illegal fishing. Annually, the Coast Guard assets join with teams from other countries to patrol the waters of the North Pacific for IUU vessels, particularly the highly destructive high seas drift nets. China has provided enforcement officials to deploy on U.S. Coast Guard ships since the MOU was first entered into force in 1993. This cooperation has led to 18 interdictions and enforcement actions against vessels in the high-scale drift net fisheries. Port State Measures Agreement entered into force in June of 2016. Since then, the Coast Guard has screened 100,000 vessels in our ship's arrival notification system and the Advanced Notice of Arrival, ANOA, for foreign vessels. Specifically, the Coast Guard developed and implemented a mechanism to analyze and identify potential IUU vessels entering a U.S. port and facilitate NOAA's ability to conduct port state measure inspections. These are all really great accomplishments, but we have a long way to go. As the saying goes, we don't know what we don't know. And individuals fishing illegally are going to take steps to hide their actions. They exploit the gaps in government structures and operate in areas where there is little to no effective enforcement. Within our own EEZ, it's easier, although not easy, to detect bad actors. We have a comparatively robust management system in most U.S. fisheries and have a general idea of where fishing fleets operate. Many fishermen work in coastal waters where Coast Guard air and surface assets patrol regularly, and then it's easier for us to get out there. However, there are still gaps. Challenging in resourcing and maritime domain awareness for surveillance, monitoring, and detection remain hurdles to effective enforcement. The Coast Guard has 42,000 active duty personnel. This is smaller than the New York City Police Department. We have fewer than 200 cutters. With those resources, we have to patrol 95,000 miles of coastline, 3.5 million square nautical miles of EEZ. And these assets are not pointed at the fisheries mission 24/7. The Living Marine Resources mission, which includes domestic fisheries, marine protected species, and international fisheries, accounts for less than 11% of the Coast Guard's time. Marine protected areas have been designated, several marine protected areas have been designated in recent years, both nationally and internationally, and this is great. But without adequate resources for enforcement, they've got the potential to become paper parks, protected in name only. Partnerships between agencies and organizations can more effectively combine our enforcement efforts and let us get out there. Patrolling our own EEZ is not enough. Our collective efforts for the future need to close the gaps through multilateral agreements and operations to target illicit actors. In order to do so, we must increase our ability to monitor and detect violations of law. We must do so collectively. Independently, we will never reach the goal of eliminating the vast majority of IUU fishing. We'll never get it all, but hopefully we can greatly reduce it. Shared maritime domain awareness and intelligence information will allow scarce enforcement assets to focus on targets that are more likely to be bad actors and provide a stronger deterrence for other illegal fishermen. The struggle over fishing grounds and living marine resources has the potential to become the crisis of the next century. Information sharing agreements and enhanced maritime domain awareness are absolutely critical to collective enforcement efforts. The Coast Guard's committed to working with our partners to promote effective enforcement and ultimately achieve sustainable fisheries, which is the end goal. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Conway, and thank you again to the whole panel. I'm going to open it to the floor in just a minute, but first, while you collect your thoughts and hopefully some penetrating questions, I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to throw in a few questions related to the kind of more work to be done section at the end of the report, which is a complete cop-out by us, admittedly, but this is an understudied field, so part of our mission here is to push others in the DC policy community to look at this. And one of those issues is the issue of subsidies. As Xiao mentioned, we have two different kinds of illegal fishing. We have artisanal and small-scale IUU fishing that takes place near the coasts, and then we have the distant water fishing fleets that make the news. It's not hard to if you type in IUU fishing right now, I guarantee the first article is probably going to be about a chase with a giant Chinese mothership somewhere in the Pacific. So that's what we all think of. But Nat Geo, among others, has made the argument that generally IUU fishing is in the distant water fleets is propped up by two things: slavery and state subsidies, because that's the only way it's commercially viable. What do we do about that issue? Right now we have the WTO, I think in December, potentially coming to some kind of agreement on state subsidies, but the Chinese, at least according to the latest reports, are trying to water that down. Do we have any good hope? And do we have the international mechanisms available to actually combat this problem? And Xiao, maybe you want to start, and Dan.
Yeah, so yes, that's a very relevant problem that has been identified already for a while, and that affects both large industrial distant water fishing fleets and small-scale fishing too. So I think that there was a report. I remember Dr. Enrique Sala in one of his presentations was mentioning, had this very nice map showing where fishing would be productive or not, depending on the level of subsidies that I think the focus of that was mostly on offshore fisheries, right? Like long distance water fishing fleets. So it's good that we have that information, and hopefully that information is being shared in the WTO agreements and negotiations, I mean, and that would lead to would add to the international pressure that is already there in order to try to solve this problem. At the domestic level and with the small-scale fishing fleets, there has been some similar studies in that sense. Like for example, there was a group of economists that published a report for WWF in Mexico a few years ago, showing how federal subsidies in Mexico affected different fisheries in the country, like the sardine fishery, and there was like 3 or 4 more. And that was a fantastic report because it actually showed that, I don't remember exactly which one was it, but some of these fisheries were sustained exclusively because of the subsidies, not because of the price that the fishermen or the fisher folk get by selling the seafood products. So, but at the same time, and I think that one of the major hurdles there is the issue of that this is a very politically charged issue. So subsidies in some regions and for some communities are a way for certain political factions to keep a certain leeway of power in the region. So it's very difficult for them to say, hey, okay, let's forget about the subsidies and move to a different management model. Another issue regarding subsidies is that in many cases, subsidies are assigned individually instead of being assigned to institutions, by which I mean like organizations of fishers, like fishing cooperatives. And what I've seen in some studies is that creates a tension between individual fisher folk and their organizations. Because, like, for example, if they get the fuel subsidy that is for the individual, they don't want to give that extra fuel to the organization, even though in many cases the organization, the fishing cooperative, is the one that actually buys the fuel for everybody. So that's yes, I think that's it would be it's of course in the international agenda, and it's a key issue that needs to be solved.
Thank you, Greg. It's a great question, and international trade negotiations and reduction in fishing subsidies is rarely a place to look for hope in the world. And I think that remains the case today, unfortunately. I mean, distant water fishing fleets are subsidized to the tune of multi-billions per year, and it contributes directly to the overcapacity in fishing fleets that results in mismanagement of fish stocks, which in turn results in reduction in fish stocks. And it's been a well-known issue for a long time, and nobody's quite cracked that, not for exactly these kind of reasons. It is a entirely political question that some countries just don't want to answer towards. But again, it speaks to the overcapacity issue, and one area where there could be progress is there's been a bubbling movement to ban transshipment on the high seas and in countries' EEZs. Transshipment is the process by which fishing trawlers load their catch onto a mothership, and that mothership then gives them food, supplies, fuel, everything so they can stay out longer, enabling boats to stay out for a year or even 2 years at a time. So another way to get at the subsidies issue is to ban transshipment, because it also allows these boats to fish longer and harder and further from their ports. Now, I have to be a little careful here because these results are in process, but I can say that there's going to be some very interesting news on the subsidies front on high seas fishing next spring, particularly in regards to how it is uneconomic to fish in most of the places on the high seas without subsidies, or even with subsidies. But, as they say, watch that space.
One more question, and then we'll throw to the audience. A term that comes up in the report is fisheries crime, which is a relatively new term, and it has emerged largely because illegal fishing is an administrative issue, not a criminal issue. And so if you get caught illegally fishing, you get a fine, a slap on the wrist, and usually you're back fishing the next week or the next month. Whereas if you're illegally fishing and also smuggling cocaine or also keeping human slaves, that can put you in prison. And this is still a term, still an approach to combat IUU fishing that is slowly but steadily gaining traction around the world. So for Lieutenant Conway, could you speak a bit to how the USCG is thinking about melding the missions of combating illegal fishing while also trying to look for all of the other illegal stuff that goes on illegal fishing boats?
Yes. On the legal perspective, I don't know about crime versus not crime, and I know that tends to be it may be a touchy subject using that word. But I do think that we need to make sure that our definition of illegal fishing is the same, not just in the United States, but globally. As far as the Coast Guard itself looking at fishing in conjunction with other crimes, I think that's extremely important, and I think that would be a very good way to get a little bit more resources to the fisheries mission. As I said, we're kind of the redheaded stepchild when it comes to funding and resource hours and assets. And I think that if we see a little bit more of things like sharks with cocaine inside, then that could help us out for getting more assets and more time available to look for fishing. That way we can kind of kill two birds with one stone and look at all these other mission types and do them together. So.
I just wanted to add to that I mean that's a very relevant question, and it seems that, for example, some drug trafficking networks have already transitioned this sort of changing mindset. And the case of the Totoaba illegal fishery in the Gulf of California is a good example of that. So the illegal traffic of Totoaba bladders to the Chinese market reached a point in which during some years recently, the price of a kilogram of a Totoaba bladder was equivalent to the price of cocaine. So at first, that I think that started as a purely problem of overfishing and overexploitation, because the Totoaba has been protected in Mexico since the 70s when the fishery crashed. And some studies show that the fishery was recovering, but has been very affected in the last 5-6 years, because some fishermen identified that they could be earning a year of their salary in just one night. The problem is that drug trafficking networks identified this as a source of income, and so they have started doing this themselves, and becoming illegal fishers and using fishers in the region to fish for Totoaba, and using their own networks to smuggle the Totoaba bladders into the United States and to other countries. But at the same time, it goes back to what you were mentioning a moment ago. So if we treat illegal fishing of Totoaba as a case of illegal fishing, then It's just an administrative sanction. They take the totoaba, they might remove the fishing gear from the fisherman, but that's it. While if you consider this as a sort of a drug trafficking crime, then the person responsible can spend several years in jail. So it's a question on the legal implementation. If drug trafficking networks have transitioned to illegal fishing in some specific cases like the totoaba, the question is then how do we treat on the side of criminal law this new situation?
Thank you. With that, I'd like to throw it open to questions from the floor. Just 3 rules. Wait for a microphone so that folks watching on the live stream can hear you. Identify yourself, please, and make sure your question involves a question and not just a statement. Up front first here.
Hi, Bill Frymore with Stewart & Stewart. Really important contribution that you're making today. Very interested. I want to ask you about the U.S. IUU executive order. It's sort of a 2-part question here, but U.S. IUU executive order, which Obama administration issued as they were going out the door, Trump administration's defended and is implementing as of January 2018. What's the impact of that program on what you're doing, if any? And then the other part of this that you haven't really gotten into, where there have been a lot of subsidies, is not the Open Seas program, but perhaps even more so in Asian societies, the mercantilist societies that we all know that put a lot of government subsidies in, on the fishing ponds, on aquaculture. I don't think there's a national security implication of that, although there have been slave labor and allegations and confirmations in that sector as well. If you could comment on those 2 things, the U.S. IUU policy and the idea of what's going on in the area of the ponds, particularly in Asia. Ecuador also has a pretty robust program, but it's more perhaps better managed. Full disclosure, I work with the U.S. shrimp industry.
I'm actually not terribly familiar with the U.S. IUU, the policy that you're referring to. As far as aquaculture goes, as the Coast Guard, we don't work with it, but from a personal interest, I think that is an excellent next step to focus on aquaculture and try and wean folks away. And I can't speak to subsidies, but I think that aquaculture could be a good way to allow a source of protein to feed a growing population of the world, as long as we do it in a way that's sustainable. I know certain aquacultures are better than others, and better for the environment than others, but I think that there's, in all types of aquaculture, there's potential to really improve and allow the fish to grow and feed folks without pillaging the oceans.
I'll put my environmentalist hat on for the aquaculture bit. Aquaculture is an important solution moving forward, but all reports I have seen out of Asia and many of the aquaculture operations there is that they are operated in an unsustainable manner that contribute to fish disease, that contribute to serious genetic problems, and have the capacity for these aquaculture operations to spill over if we're talking coastal aquaculture, to spill over into nearby areas and act as essentially invasive species. Until I see a convincing case that the regulatory system there is strong for that kind of aquaculture, I am skeptical on it. Regarding the IUU executive order, they made great strides moving forward, but I would say that there's still a lot to be done. I mean, to go back to something that the Lieutenant was saying, for their job, they are massively underfunded, understaffed, under-resourced. And so when it's my job to help find these international assets that some of our partner countries can use in the U.S., it's really hard for me to go to the Coast Guard and say, hey, can you delegate one of your staffers to come down and do a training for us, or to help develop these regulations, because I know how understaffed they are and how much work they actually have to do in the U.S.
Yes, I think that both Lieutenant Conway and Dan did very well. One additional aspect that I would add is that I think that the executive order on IUU fishing is good as another way of, one thing that we have seen with the development of environmental law in general in the world, which is that we see the United States being the leader, and that provides a good like general guidance for other countries to join forces. There's another thing that I think it can be very, very useful, which is this seafood traceability rule that is supposed to enter into force in January next year. Particularly thinking about the management of small-scale fisheries, which is sort of my preferred area of analysis, I think that might be very useful in order to be able to separate the good and the bad in the way of specific fishing producers in developing nations, for example, that are exporting their products into the U.S. market. And of course, on the issue of aquaculture, it's a very it's becoming an even more urgent environmental problem, and there are many. It seems that it's relatively low, a relatively low-cost activity. There are many countries in which we have these informal aquaculture ponds that are operating virtually unregulated, and that goes back again to the need to have a good seafood traceability system in place to make sure that those products are out of the market.
Anybody else?
Mike Gravitz with the Marine Conservation Institute. We worked really hard for about 2 years to get the implementation law for the Port States Measure Agreement passed after the Pew Charitable Trust got the treaty done, which was a pretty remarkable feat. My question is, the Magnuson-Stevens Act is about to be reauthorized in some fashion in the next year or two. There are a number of versions floating around in the Senate and the House for improvements or sort of rollbacks in the law, if you will. But almost none of those things would affect IU fishing. The U.S. has a regime that I think is pretty ineffective for tamping down the import of illegal seafood. It relies on this biennial reporting system that is much less effective than the European system for issuing countries yellow and red cards. I mean, when countries get yellow and red cards, they pay a lot of attention. When they get onto the U.S. List, the biennial list, they don't do much. So the question is, what are the 2 or 3 things, I'm a very practical guy, what are the 2 or 3 things that we ought to be thinking about doing while Magnuson-Stevens is going to be reauthorized that would improve the situation in the United States? And you know, we're the world's first or second largest importer of seafood. A lot of it comes from high IUU countries like China. And we ought to be a much bigger part of the solution to this international problem than we are today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. As you said, the U.S. system for this kind of work has been relatively ineffective just because it's a massive problem and hasn't really caught up with the times at this point. For those of you who don't know, the Europeans have a very effective system where if they catch illegal fishing or they suspect illegal fishing or other problems in the industry in a certain country, they will issue that country what they call a yellow card, a warning saying if you don't improve your system within a year, we're going to cease imports of this supply. That has been tremendously effective. All you have to do is look at Thailand. Thailand has historically been a hotbed for illegal fishing. The EU issued them a yellow card, a year or 2 ago, and they have made massive changes in just that time, a place where we never thought we could make progress. The U.S. clearly needs a system like the yellow card, and whether that means pairing up with the Europeans to support theirs or creating our own, I'm not sure, but Mike, that's a great point.
some positive things that have happened in the U.S. in the last year or so. With the Port State Measures Agreement, we negatively certified Mexico due to their fishing practices, and with the Port State Measures Agreement going into effect and not allowing fishing vessels to come into Brownsville to refuel, we have seen improvements. And although it's still kind of in the baby stages, we're very positive that this will improve in the future.
No, I think that summarizes all very well. I will just reinforce the idea that getting more countries signing the Port State Measures Agreement would be good, particularly in the context in which we are talking that there is very weak rule of law in the high seas, so all these sorts of actions can be very effective. The problem that I saw with the implementation of the Port State Measures Agreement is, again, the need to have specific procedures and enforcement and training. So all that goes back to the need of funding, to provide funding to those nations that want to improve their actions against illegal fishing, but they need help both in terms of technology and training. So the Port State Measures Agreement has this funding mechanism. What I hope, I haven't seen it recently, but what I hope is that it doesn't happen with the same that happened with the straddling stocks agreement, which that also has its own funding mechanism, but it was underfunded for years.
I would first pile on to Dan's point about the way the Europeans do this versus the way we do. You know, when you go to the Thailand example, which was largely driven by this very public year-long investigative report by the AP first, and then others piled on, the yellow card was highly effective. Our response was to downgrade Thailand to Tier 3 in the annual Trafficking in Persons report, which should notionally come with automatic sanctions, but we, of course, gave them an optional national security exemption like we do almost every country that's downgraded to Tier 3 on the TIP report. So, yes, the Thais wanted to get off, and they lobbied here heavily in Washington from the embassy to get off because it's a reputational black eye, but there was no real threat of sanctions, whereas for the Europeans, there was a real threat of a hit to the pocketbook, and that had an effect. I'd also, you asked for specific recommendations. Two, one is reiterating Xiao's point about the need to fully implement the proposed traceability program. If there's a game changer, I think it's the notion that if you can get kind of proof of concept on a real viable traceability program that can then be used as a model in other places, you can get to almost a market-oriented focus where, big fishing companies end up getting into this traceability program for access to the U.S. and European markets, and it just becomes the standard over time, and you get a market solution to what we're probably not going to get as a full government solution. The other is we desperately need more money and ships for the Coast Guard. It is an impossible mission for, as we heard, one of the smallest staffed agencies in the U.S. that are supposed to not only protect one of the world's largest EEZs, but also somehow be a beacon to the world in training and cooperation throughout all of the high seas, and do it with 200 ships. Next question? Oh, sorry, Dan. Go ahead.
Sorry, to add one thing there. In regards to leveraging more assets for the Coast Guard, I think that there's a really interesting opportunity coming up this fall with the National Security Strategy. Illegal fishing should be included in the U.S. National Security Strategy as an important problem. That will then leverage things like Navy gray hulls to allow more illegal fishing operations in places like the South Pacific. There's a great operation, OMSI, the Oceania Maritime Security Initiative, that allows passing gray hulls to have, correct me if I'm wrong, Coast Guard operators on board who can then act as ship riders to some of the neighboring nations and enforce their fisheries law. This is a simple fix to add a lot more assets to this fight.
With that, sorry, real quick. This is great having Coast Guard assets on Navy ships, but it tends to be on the Navy schedule. If there's a ship passing, then that's where they'll go and what they'll do, and it may not necessarily go to the right spot, to the hot spot of where the fishing fleets are. And it's a big ocean, and we need to have a little bit more data sharing for satellite information on where these ships are, and different agencies may have that information and not be able to share it legally or just through different like commitments between organizations and countries. So we would like more Coast Guard assets in general and data sharing.
Next question. Let's go up here to the front.
Hi, Cindy Braden, and I'm representing a new organization created to help combat illicit trade across 11 industry sectors called the Alliance, the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, and fisheries is one of the 11 sectors. And first I want to comment that your report today is very well done and will provide us with some great food for thought going forward. My question is, how do you panelists view working with the private sector to help develop some mechanisms that can be put in place via sharing information, advocating stronger regulatory systems across the world? How do you envision working with the private sector to help solve this problem?
At Pristine Seas, we have a very direct operational link with the private sector with regards to surveilling marine protected areas, and I will talk about just our little spot in the world. We work with a number of private sector companies who specialize in surveillance technologies, satellite providers, radar technologies, all of these cool new gadgets and these companies are often looking for new places to look, to test technology, but it's hard to find these areas, and so we try to act as a go-between for private companies who are looking to test their new systems or to bring in their technologies to then help surveil these marine protected areas. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that there is a fantastic role that the private sector can play in all this in many different aspects. And what Dan mentioned is a great example. We have fantastic high-tech companies developing amazing new technologies that will facilitate a lot the enforcement operations. A key legal debate there, ongoing legal debate, is how we can use the data that we get from those new technologies to produce evidence that will be valid for prosecution. And so that's one aspect. I would like to refer also to, and I think it's something that we have touched a moment ago, the importance also of getting big buyers, so the big companies in the seafood production chain involved in buying products that we know that are harvested in a sustainable way, and this involves both aquaculture and fishing. And also, I think that there is a great opportunity to work with producers. So many small associations, or not that small, but associations of small-scale fishers are very aware of the need of sustainable use their living resources of the ocean, and they want to seek for the best ways. And some associations of fishers have actually been very successful and have developed highly productive and profitable economic activities. So that's another way of, I think, that in which we can work directly with the private sector to improve the situation.
I would say there's one other critical place, and that's at least in terms of just illegal fishing, is there's an increasing movement to work with insurers and reinsurers to make sure that these companies can't get insurance for their boats, so that when they get impounded, that they can't just, or when they get sunk by a Southeast or South China or a nation in Asia, they can't just get a new one. And this is a critical step forward, and it's just starting to happen this fall. So I think that would be a really interesting place to work as well.
I just anecdotally add, as part of the research for the report, I went to the annual Our Oceans Conference this year, which Dan and Xiao were both at as well, and I suspect it was the same in previous years, but all of the most interesting things don't happen on the main stage where the governments are speaking. All the most interesting things happen on the exhibition stage, where private sector is talking about things like, boosting monitoring capacity with nanosatellites and developing basically a meat thermometer that can do genomic testing on where a fish is from, or trying to create indexes to bring a cost to bear on companies who invest in illegal fishing. So while there's, governments are always going to be the ones doing enforcement on both ends of that, whether it's the market end or the monitoring end, I think the future is with the private sector far more than it is with the public sector.
I do think it's important to work with emerging technologies. The current technologies we have are great, but they can be spoofed, and fishermen are not dumb, and people are able to work around the systems. So new technology is not ever going to be negative.
Next question? Right up front.
Hi, my name's Linda Glover, and I have a national security background, but I think my affiliation that's most relevant today to this group is I'm on the board at Mission Blue, and I'm also part of a small group that's establishing a new program at the Aspen Institute called the High Seas Initiative. I have a simple kind of off-the-wall question, but when it comes to enforcement of not just the illegal fishing, but also the related crimes on the high seas, is Interpol involved at all? Should they be? Is anybody talking about them being?
Interpol is very involved. They have a great fish crimes unit that helps distribute information amongst partner nations. Illegal fishing is clearly a problem that the devil is in the details, and it's really hard to get collaboration going between different member states, and Interpol acts as a very effective clearinghouse for data that is otherwise confidential that can then be distributed to other parties.
Yes, on the side.
Thank you very much. A very interesting conversation today. My name is Tom Gross. I'm recently retired from the UNESCO and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission there. And within the UN system, oceans are been elevated recently through the SDG 14. There's a lot of hope that something better can come out of the cooperation at the international level. However, the United States has recently pulled out permanently from UNESCO, and they've never signed the Law of the Sea. And we see even more reluctance under this administration to become involved with global agreements. Is there a role for the United States in trying to push forward the international agreements that you all seem to say are necessary to do the essentials of simply defining what's illegal fishing and so many other things which would benefit from simple agreements at the international level? And I'm just curious if you can get into this political question of what's the U.S. role in this type of negotiation.
I'll just speak as far as multilateral and bilateral agreements and the thought that those are very important and needed and used, especially in the South Pacific. And I think the more bilateral agreements that we have will be better. I don't want to speak on the broader worldwide stage. I don't have the expertise.
Well, I think that the role of the United States will be relevant in any case. We see that changes in government always lead to sometimes very significant changes in policy priorities. But for me, like when I started learning about environmental law, it was striking for me to see that one of the major developers and drivers of environmental law in the United States was actually a Republican president, Richard Nixon. So I think that in the long term, what we have seen, at least in the development of the efforts towards better ocean conservation globally, the role of the United States is very positive. And Greg mentioned the organization of our ocean conferences. That was something that was an outcome of the previous administration, and now is flying on its own. And the European Union was the organizer this year. Next year it will be Indonesia, I think. So yes, I think that in any case, it's very relevant for the United States to be active in the international efforts to ensure better management of our ocean.
Yeah, I would, not to sound flippant, but on just about anything that doesn't require Senate ratification, the U.S. is a leader in fisheries and environmental law. So, we were a driving force behind the Port State Measures Agreement, are still a driving force in spreading implementation, driving force behind the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. In the case of UNCLOS, point of clarification, we signed, we haven't ratified. But since we signed, every administration and every relevant government agency for the last 3 decades has acted as if UNCLOS were in effect, and therefore our best state practices get spread around the world, and we treat this as a matter of customary law. So, the U.S., except for kind of the very big ratification requiring treaties, the U.S. plays a role here. It's damaging to our reputation, admittedly. We haven't really ratified a major treaty in quite some time, and I don't think we're going to do it anytime soon. But we have enough tools in the toolbox that within the executive, I think you can still see the U.S. playing a major leading role in implementing new rules and agreements.
Yeah. Progress happens in fits and starts. Sometimes we move forward, sometimes we move backwards. In purely political terms, in the work that we do, creation of the inspiration of creation of large-scale marine protected areas, the recent steps back by the U.S. has actually been a galvanizing force. We've seen other countries in the world who see the U.S., stepping back on these issues as an opportunity to step forward and start to lead themselves and to bring together regional initiatives to take the place of a larger superpower to lead on these issues. One place we can work, though, right now, is on illegal fishing as a national security issue. This is not a partisan issue at this point. I mean, we estimate that 20% of seafood imports into the U.S. are illegally caught. That is seafood that isn't coming from American workers. It's taking away jobs from fishermen in Hawaii. This is an easy place to work right now, and whether or not we're willing to stand up on a big political stage and say so is one thing, but as Greg alluded to, there are many tools we can use right now.
We have time for one more, if anybody has a question. Yep, in the back.
Actually, I don't have a real question, but I would like to share something. Thanks for the report. As a Thai person, thank you for your concern on my country. We have a lot of improvement in terms of IUU fishing in the countries, but I am also representing U.S. Agency for International Development. My mission is based in Bangkok, Thailand. It's a regional development mission for Asia. We have done a lot of work in this area, and a lot of questions that you asked about, engaging private sector. Yes, we are working together and partnering with Thai Union, which is the biggest exporter for the fishing, to accelerate these issues and help to strengthen the legal fishing. We also work in terms of satellite data for the catch documentation and traceability. So that's how the U.S. play an important role in using the soft power to solve the problem. And this is the report that's going to help us to use as a baseline to work further. We also work with the CFDEC, which is a regional organization under ASEAN who work directly on the legal issue. We try to help them accelerate the new agreement or policy as a regional entity. So the questions that you raised before, maybe you can have more answer if you are interested in our work in the region. Thank you.
So an endorsement for the Southeast Asia Fisheries Development Council, which is not something I hear very often. All right. Well, thank you again for everybody coming out, making it clear that there is a community within the national security policy world here in Washington that does care about fisheries crime, and I hope we can stay involved. Thank you.